my favorite hymns of all time, really, in the Methodist hymnal is called Now the Green Blade Riseth. It's an old-timey song that's typically sung at Easter, and it draws a parallel between the death and the resurrection of Jesus with how wheat lies in the earth as a single grain, and eventually it sprouts to become this plant that feeds people. And the first verse says, "Now the green blade riseth from the buried grain, wheat that in the dark earth many days has lain. Love lives again, that with the dead has been. Love is come again, like wheat that springeth green." That's the first verse. There's two funny things, at least to me, about that hymn. The first is that the tune that we sing it to is actually a Christmas carol. It's a French Christmas carol called Noël Nouvelet, which was translated from the French to English, "Sing we now of Christmas." You know, "Sing we now of Christmas, sing we now Noel," that thing. And if you don't know that song, by the way, don't worry. It's a really old song. We don't really sing it that much anymore, right? Now, you can find "Now the Green Blade Riseth" in that hymnal, in the United Methodist hymnal, right in front of you. It's on page 311 if you want to study the full lyrics. I think it is the most beautiful song in the entire hymnal. Really, really beautiful. Now, I wanted to show you an interesting arrangement of the song for a choir because I think it illustrates what the song is trying to say perfectly. The video I'm about to show you is really, really raw, so please don't mind the low quality or the coughing sounds that you hear in the audience. Instead, try to concentrate on the way that the choir expresses what's going on in the song. You might even want to look at the lyrics in the hymnal just to get the full effect, to really hear what they're saying. So again, that was page 311 if you want to do it. That's what I would do if I was there, honestly. Yeah. So the way that the arrangement opens is definitely not the way the song in your hymnal opens at all, but I thought it was really cool. That opening is my favorite part of the whole deal. "Now," sings the choir. "Now." Right now. Think of a seed in the earth, right? All the right conditions exist for that seed to germinate and start to grow. The soil is rich with all the right nutrients. The temperature is really nice. It's not too damp down there, not too cold, not too dry. Nothing is digging at the earth trying to eat the seed. It's just sitting there waiting. How does a seed know when to germinate? It doesn't have a brain, right? It doesn't have any programming that we know or understand where it can keep time and then some alarm goes off and pop, out it comes. It just seems to know what to do. Here's another question. Why do you think Jesus laid for 3 days in the tomb? I mean, really think about it. Why 3 days? Think about every piece of paper, all our ideas throughout time as a society based on Christian ideas. Think how they would be different if the Lord had come out of the tomb in 4 days. Think of how important the number 3 is for us. Why do we count to 3? Or count down from 3 when we take photos, when we discipline our children? 1, 2. When we jump down into pools, through the atmosphere, from bungee cords, or take any leap of faith. Why is 3 the number? Why not 4? To some people, asking these kinds of questions is a complete waste of time. How can we ever know the answers? Folks like that would say. I can assure you, I am not one of those people. And I'm deadly serious about that. I want to know. I ask. Or at least I want to try to understand. Now, a seed germinates because the right conditions are present for it to do so. That's not an explanation, by the way. Because what conditions? We know a few of them. I described them: the condition of the soil, the temperature, the water. But would every seed of a certain kind of plant germinate if we could somehow create the perfect conditions necessary for it? I'll tell you, farmers have been wrestling with that question for a long time. The truth is, thanks to relatively modern technology, that the gold standard for wheat seed germination, the percentage to shoot for, is 85%. That means that 15% of all the seeds put into the ground never germinate, even if all the right conditions have been met. 15%. That makes me kind of sad. 15% will never grow? Oh, y'all are going to learn about wheat today. Yes, you are. Did you know that there's a measure in agriculture when it comes to crop yield, which is the amount of product produced in a certain plot of land, but also how much seed individual plants make? For example, if the crop produces 3 grains for every single grain that was seeded, the yield is 1 in 3. That ratio, you may not have known this, is super important. It's considered the bare minimum necessary to sustain human life throughout the world. One of those 3 seeds needs to be set aside for the next planting season, right? The other 2 can either be consumed by the grower, or 1 by the grower and 1 for their livestock, if they have any. 1 in 3. That's weird how numbers work, right? They are very important. If you were a farmer and you didn't know that ratio, you might never make enough to survive, to feed your family, unless for some reason you were blessed with a surprisingly abundant harvest year after year. You'd just be guessing about how much to plant and how much to consume. Eventually, you would starve unless you had some other way to make money. If I was building an airplane and I needed to service it, I'd better know how many parts it has, right? Because when one part goes bad, the consequences could be huge. An airliner has somewhere between 4 to 6 million parts. Your car, about 30,000. We don't really think about any of those parts until one goes bad, right? A very important one. And when it does, well, people die when a plane takes a nosedive because of faulty programming in the computers. It makes the news, right? Or you have to be without your car for a couple hours, or maybe even weeks if the problem is really bad. And that has consequences for your life. Now, the wonderful people that keep track of all these numbers are called engineers. They work with the inventors, right? Who know the numbers. Obviously, they built the thing. They need to know these things to keep it going. But who invented the wheat seed? And who breathed new life into Jesus on the 3rd day? The 3rd day. Why the 3rd day? Questions can be troublesome and annoying things, right? But like the mechanic that works on your vehicle when it breaks down, you can put your trust in the idea that somebody knows how to get things going again. Even though we don't trust mechanics and most of the time we expect them to swindle us, we still go to them, right? And most of the time, we get our car back in drivable condition. But no one knows how to resurrect the dead. No one. That's why death is so hard on us. There is no hope of bringing our deceased loved ones back into our lives. The same is true about a lot of things. When we don't understand how something works, when we don't have anyone trustworthy to turn to so we can figure a thing out, we lose hope. We feel helpless. If we were to stay that way, in that condition, we would never grow or mature or move forward. We just stay there in our hopelessness. And that happens to an awful lot of people. You know who I'm talking about. You've seen them in your lives. Maybe you are one of them, or you've been one of them at some point in your life. It's not until something or someone comes along and starts poking us, prodding us to get us going that we start to move from that death-like stillness. That's why I love that video so much. I'm picturing the Lord over that seed in the ground, whispering, now. Again, now. Now. Now, yelling, now. Right? Let's go. Let's move it. God's like an EMT doing chest compressions or using the paddles to get the heart beating again. Now. And life springs forth. It does. The wheat sends this shoot upward and roots downward. Wheat has some of the deepest roots of any cultivated plant. They go almost 2 meters down. That really helps the plant get the water it needs if there's this dry season. The shoot makes leaves, and every leaf that extends powers the plant to keep growing up. Finally, the last leaf to grow is the biggest. It's the thickest. It powers the plant the most of any of the other leaves to allow it to begin making seeds. Now, the Gospel of John records a time where some Greeks, having heard about Jesus' ministry, approached one of the disciples and requested to meet with him. And we don't really know what they discussed. Scripture doesn't record that. What it does record is what Jesus says about what is happening, why these Greeks came up to him at all, which was very odd. See, word of his ministry had spread to the point that people beyond the Holy Land were hearing about it. And we heard some of his words in the reading for today. I think there's a lot that we can learn from those words, especially when you think about how a plant grows from a seed. Jesus tells us that the only way life can continue is through death. A seed dies, gets buried, but if the conditions are right, it becomes a new plant. It bears fruit. It makes more seeds, which in turn make more plants, which in turn can sustain more life beyond just making new plants. All of humanity depends on this process to be able to eat, and not just to survive, but thrive. Everything you see around you is possible because of that process. If a seed stays a seed, nothing happens. Nothing happens. To live again, you have to be willing to allow for death. That's just the way it is. That principle applies to so many things. But for the purposes of this sermon, I just want to focus on one: which I'll end on, and that's this church. Churches are living things. Anyone that has had a position of leadership in one knows this intimately. So many processes are at work, so many moving parts, so much memory. Decisions affect the organism, but ultimately the goal of all life is to continue life. So you want to make decisions that help life to flourish. But Jesus is telling us that in order for life to do that, we have to allow for death, or nothing happens. For this church, that means that nothing apart from God and the gospel is forever. Every single thing, every living thing has a lifespan. Every program, every ministry, everything. When Jesus considers his death, his soul is troubled, really troubled. But twice he essentially says the same thing about it. Not my will, but yours be done. The first time is in the reading we heard today. What should I say, Father? Save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. The second was at Gethsemane, when he was sweating it out in prayer and fear and said, not my will, but yours be done. An old pastor once told me that the secret to his success as a minister was to keep some pruning shears on his shelf to remind him of this truth of Jesus, death into life, and to keep them sharp, razor sharp. When you tend a plant, sometimes you've got to cut the dead stuff off to allow the plant to flourish. The same is true of churches and of your lives. It's really hard work. It sucks. Because first, you've got to admit that something has died. And that is probably the hardest part, at least for me. Then you have to be willing to cut something, which is essentially doing violence to a living thing. And you know that this violence will cause the plant pain. But if you don't do it, nothing happens. Things stay the same. Hope does not spring forth. Life doesn't continue. And the divine purpose for which you and this church has been called never happens. The greatest joy you will ever know can go unfulfilled when you are unwilling to do what is necessary for life to flourish. I don't want to live like that. Do you? Comfort and stillness are for the dead. Pain is part of life, and forward movement, maturity, and growth. This might seem like a hopeless point of view. No one wants to live a life filled with pain. But the living can take comfort in the fact that the author of life, the inventor of our very being, knows the numbers and is working tirelessly to make the conditions right for our future growth as people and as a church. And that is as true for the living as it is for the dead. Now, the Lord says, right now. And in 2 weeks, we'll celebrate how God has made all things new. Amen.